What is ICF? Well, if you've often wondered that, you've come to the right place. ICF stands for Insulated Concrete Forms. Essentially what ICF is it's hollow Lego block with styrofoam on each side, and you fill it with concrete. And so today we're going to cover a ton of information. I'm going to deliver it as quickly as possible, so we won't be able to go in depth on all the topics, but it'll give you a nice overview of everything. There'll be lots of photos to back up what I'm saying and lots of demonstration type of stuff. So I'm going to deliver it pretty quick, but it's going to cover a ton on this topic. So let's jump into it. Today we're going to cover what is ICF, what are the features of it, the frequently asked questions. So that's very important because there's always quite a few and they're always very common. We're going to talk about air tightness and energy efficiency. Before we jump into it, here's my favorite feature of ICF. After you're done pouring and it's set up and you strip all your bracing down, ICF is really the only true monolithic wall system there is. On this commercial job, we specially got out the drone and I was told the guys, go and body check those walls. The best way to demonstrate that these walls are freestanding, they don't need a floor or a roof to hold themselves up, and it's the only wall system that'll do that. Every other one that I've seen, whether it's precast concrete or wood framing, SIPS panels, all of those need a roof to help basically complete the integrity of the structure. And ICF doesn't need that, right? We just need a roof to keep the insulation and the rain out of her. So the difference between ICF and conventional construction is this ICF, it's insulated concrete form. It's the formwork as well as the whole assembly. So in conventional, you would bring in a bunch of formwork and you would set it all up. You would pour your concrete and then you strip all that formwork down. But you still have no insulation value. So now you have to do additional framing and you have to figure out how to insulate that thing. And then you got to try to keep it airtight. With ICF this is the formwork. It's everything. It's 4 or 5 steps all done at one time. You stack this, like I said, like Lego. You place your rebar and a few other elements, and then you fill it with concrete and you're done. You do not strip the foam off. It's fully insulated at this point. So you've taken care of your structure, your framing, you have the insulation, you're airtight, everything all done at one time. Now it's time for frequently asked questions. So number 1, what is ICF? We've already covered that. So number 2, what type of construction can you use it for? Well, typically ICF is known for basements. And if you know anyone that has an ICF basement, they'll be like, oh, it's so comfy, it's cool in the summer, it's just cozy all the time because there's no air leakage and it's lots of insulation. But what people they kind of stop, they hit their brain cap right there and they don't realize that you can just do ICF and just keep going another floor and take it to the roof. We've been doing ICF to the roof since 2012, so over a decade now. Other buildings that you can use it for, multi-story. You can use it for commercial. We just finished one a year ago. You can do simple or complex structures. So we've done both houses where you have just a simple square box. You have another that might have a few jogs. And then we have ones that are very complicated, multi-story, multi-corners, corner windows, big openings, all that. You can use it for shops. And another feature I like is there's systems that you can incorporate a structural slab, kind of like a parkade. So you could have a garage and you could drive in underneath that garage, or you could have a theater room under your garage or anything like that. So it's all incorporated because you're building with concrete and you can design it any way you want, and you always have a structural integrity in there. So don't forget, you can always go higher, and the benefits are unbelievable, and we won't even be able to cover them all today. So another question I get is, do I need to frame additional walls on the inside? No, you do not. And that leads us into the next one. The reason you don't need to frame additional walls is because These are called, I call them, they're either called snap ties or ties. So these ties, or some people refer to them as webs, they're every 8 inches. So this is what's incorporated into the block that withstands the force of concrete while you're pouring it. It's all engineered. It's amazing how it can hold tens of thousands of pounds of concrete, not blow to smithereens. So you can see that here is an indication of where a tie is, so that later you know where to attach to. Now here I've actually gone and stripped some of the foam off, but these ties are 1.25 inches wide, and they sit about 1/2 inch below the surface. See there? And those are your attachment points. And they've engineered all this stuff. There's engineering on nails, how much pressure they hold, screws, all that stuff. So you can quite literally fasten anything to this. And if you're on a house, you don't need to vapor barrier anything. You have to vapor barrier your ceiling and tie it into the wall. But beyond that, you can just go ahead and just attach your drywall straight to this, right? You just screw right into it. So it's not that hard. And that's the point of the video, is answering these simple questions will help open up your mind to being like, oh man, well, the ingenuity behind this system is unbelievable, because there's so many things it covers. Sometimes I say it's almost so simple that it's over people's heads. Like, they think that it needs to be more complicated than it is. I don't know if I mentioned this. You can attach drywall, plywood, vinyl siding, stucco, hardy plank, engineered wood, anything to these buildings. So another big question is electrical. Well, how do you do electrical? Well, there's a couple ways. A lot of the electricians that I've worked with don't charge any extra money to do it. They essentially, I've seen guys do it quite often with an electric chainsaw. And through the end, there's that little hole. You just run a bolt there, and you can just cut through the foam, and you gouge out for where your wire goes. The most recent electrician used a router, and he just freehanded a router, went wherever he wanted to. You stuff the wires into the track, you cut out where your boxes are. You can screw the box to the tie. You can concrete screw it to the back. Some boxes actually have wings that flare out and actually cut and grip into the foam. So not to get too in depth, but the electrical isn't as hard as you think. You know, maybe rather than going horizontal all the time, you can go vertical. It doesn't matter. When you're at the top wall or the top connection where your truss is, you got to drill through the top plate. The top plate's structural to hold the trusses down, or the roof. You just drill through that and up into the attic, and you're freewheeling, right? So it's not that it's just different. It's not that it's any more complicated. No matter what, in a stud house, you got to drill thousands of holes. It's a pain in the butt no matter what. You got to gouge some foam, stuff the wire in, spray foam it afterwards. We did, on the commercial job we did, they actually, on the spec sheet, is they wanted conduits for future in the walls. So the electricians were a little more rugged on cutting out. They cut out way too much foam, but it didn't matter. It doesn't affect the integrity. It doesn't affect the R value or the air tightness of the building. So they have these extra big gouges, and we just spray foamed it after, rasped it flush, ready for drywall. Plumbing is another topic that we get in questions all the time. You don't typically have a whole bunch of plumbing in your outside walls. Typically, the most common place, probably on every job, is you're venting for one of your sinks. Usually your kitchen sink ends up on the wall because it's always below a window, or that's typical, right? So you have the venting pipe, which is, in our area, 1.5 inch ABS. You just gouge out the foam. You do your vent stack in there, spray foam afterward, cut it flush. As long as it's below the surface, you're ready for drywall again. Now, in the floors, rather than, you could run the drain down, but it's more difficult, like running it in the foam. We usually just have your drain pipe coming up through the floor, whether that's concrete floor or the wood joist package. And then same with your water lines. Water lines just come through the floor. So instead of coming up and over, they just through the floor. It's not that hard, right? Now, the other thing I get, those walls are just so crooked and wavy. And it's like, I don't know where people are getting this idea from. If you do what you're told to do and how to install the system, your walls are straight as an arrow. because you have all your bracing, you have stiffener that goes inside, which helps keep it straight. You run a string line before you pour your concrete, and when you pour, then you lean your walls into your string and they're perfectly straight. So there's no waviness, right? You might sometimes, I guess where's a good example? Sometimes you'll get a little bulge where this factory joint is, it'll bulge out slightly. You might get the odd one, just 1/8 of an inch or so. You can rasp those flush, doesn't matter, right? You could have a 1/2 inch bulge and you still wouldn't come and affect the ties. You could rasp it off, but that's very rare. Now there is blowouts, that's a whole other topic. Should we cover that? I don't know. This is actually a big question, is cost. Now it's not how much does it cost, it's always how much more is it than a 2x6 or conventional building. You can weigh the costs, but if you also weigh the characteristics and the advantages. Now, in my experience, if you're building a full house, ICF's about 5% more, because it's really only the walls above the foundation that are ICF, and they're only the exterior walls. Everything else is the same. You still need a floor, you still need a kitchen, you still need bathrooms. So the overall average price is about 5% more in a full house, right? So when you compare the characteristics, it's not 5% better insulation. It's not 5% more airtight. Those numbers are substantially more. So we'll get into those quickly too. If you're building a shop, then you're probably around that 20% more to do an ICF shop than a wood frame shop or a pole shed, because now you don't have all those other costs with building a house that average the price down. You have what's a shop, a floor and walls and a roof, right? So that's why it's more. So, and still at that time, then you can weigh like 20%. Yeah, okay, well then I will go wood frame, like, right? And other people, we just built one for a guy that we built him a house 3 years ago, and now we built him an ICF shop. And even though we're not done, he's blown away. We don't even have overhead doors on, and we're heating it in the middle of the winter, and the heat's up like that. And he's like, how does it do it so fast? I got tarps on my doors. Now we're going to cover features of the ICF system. It's really hard to know where to start. Maybe one of my favorites as well is just the continuous insulation. So you have all this outside insulation and the inside. And the reason I like to go to the roof is this system, it would actually go up past the floor. The floor would hang off the wall, kind of like balloon framing. And then there's no interruption of the insulation through to the floor, right? We won't have time today, but even the slab insulation, like on an ICF house, you actually have insulation all the way under your slab. The whole assembly is continuous, no breaks. Doesn't matter conventional how you build it, you can't do that because you have insulation on the outside, then it hits the floor, then it moves to the outside and it goes up here, and there's thermal breaks and bridging everywhere. Now, I have this photo of this house that we built, fairly complicated. If you look at the picture and follow the outside, all those corners, doesn't matter how many corners are in the building, there's insulation continuous. It doesn't matter if you have 4 corners or 20. It's always continuous. So no matter what feature you build into the system, if you have lots of windows, you always have insulation between your windows and above where the headers are. And I've done videos on that before too, is going into the specifics of, hey, if this was wood, this is how much heat loss you'd have because you'd have all this wood framing that's literally zero insulation or very low. What I'll drive home on the continuous insulation is any design element is possible and you always have that insulation. Another feature is ICF is excellent for sound rating. And so that's about all I'm going to say about that. Super soundproof. Yeah, that's about it. Fire rating. Yeah, if you have a fire, heaven forbid, yeah, the foam will melt off, but you still have that concrete core. And I think at least have a 4-hour fire rating, a true one, right? So the fire won't blow through the wall, right? So they're fire rated. So I didn't even mention yet mold will not grow on this. So you have substantially less chance of mold in your house or your commercial building with this. Wind and disaster resistant. Oh man, I don't even have the specs. They can handle 400-kilometer-an-hour winds, like crazy. And how I know this is there's been multiple areas where like a hurricane comes through and the whole neighborhood is decimated and there's 1 or 2 ICF buildings still standing. So there's been people online, you can Google it, filming a hurricane from their living room in an ICF house and shit is blowing down around them and their house is fine, right? So when we're talking about design, I want to show you what the system is capable of doing. You can do a simple structure or you can do something very complicated. There's been multiple times where we've done a gable wall or like a rake wall for a vaulted ceiling. Now what I like about that is your actual pitch of the outside of your roof matches the inside of the roof. Because it's structural, you don't have to half the inside pitch. So ask me questions in the comments because there's lots of info, but I got to get through this. Corner windows, we've done those before. Fully structural because you have rebar and everything built into the system. And you always have that insulation. So no matter how much your header is inside the concrete, that lintel, that structural, you have insulation on both sides. Large openings, like this house, the guy had a 13-foot by 24-foot commercial window in his house. Round walls, in their booklets, they can show you all the different radiuses and where to cut the block and how to make curved walls. So you can do anything with the system. Yeah, it doesn't matter which one of these features you pick. It's always airtight, it's always structural, and you always have the 2 layers of insulation and there's never any thermal breaks. The freestanding walls, like I said before, that's my favorite thing is you strip all your bracing down and now you have these walls that are freestanding and oh man, the wind came up overnight. We're not worried about it blowing over, just stands, right? Earlier I talked about the characteristics like we're not 5% more airtight or 5% more R value. So this system just round numbers is an R24, but that's an effective R value. And whereas if you have a wood frame building, yeah, you have R20 or R24 bad insulation, but now they actually factor, at least in Canada, they factor the effective R value, which is the whole assembly. So now they take the average of all the lumber in the wall versus the insulation. And so now you might have an R17 wall. But you still have thermal breaks and a chance of some air infiltration. So I have videos specifically on how to add R value to this system. Like we did a commercial one, we bought a R35 block. So it's just block with 4 inches of insulation on each side. All of a sudden there's no additional labor, a tiny fraction, like maybe $2 a square foot for that extra insulation. And now we have an R35 wall. So there's a ton of different ways to add insulation to the system. I forgot to say at the beginning that just because this is an Nadura block, ICF, whether it doesn't matter all their small differences, ICF, that's what we're talking about, doesn't matter what manufacturer. Use whatever block you want to use. The system is all the same at the end of the day. So just like I said, round number, R24 to R17 is a 40% difference. So this is 40% more efficient. So when you're comparing costs, 5% more, 40% more insulation. Now air tightness, that's measured by, they call it air exchanges per hour. So they take the whole volume of the building, and a standard house built to today's standards, but conventional, a decent home's 2.5 air exchanges per hour. So that building will lose that air 2.5 times per hour, just natural draft, right? And some of the older ones are like 4, 5, 6, 7 air exchanges. So and then there's passive, well, there was R2000 spec, which was, I don't know, maybe 10 or 20 years ago. And it was, you had to have an air exchange of 1 or better to meet their spec. And then there's passive spec, which is 0.6 air exchanges per hour. So you have to meet that. And that's just one of their parameters, or you don't meet passive, their specs. So we knew they were airtight. We never even questioned it. We never tested it. We finished a house. We were just about to turn it over and we're like, okay, well, let's just do a blower door test on this. They stick a blower door in the door and it pulls all the air out of the building and actually creates a negative air pressure. And then the computer in there can actually gauge how much air you're losing. And you run the math and you say, okay, it's 30,000 cubic feet of air, and we're only losing on this house was 147 or something CFM. So that one house is 0.23 air exchanges per hour. So if you take the 0.23 versus the 2.5, that's standard practice even to today, that's tenfold. So we're 10 times more airtight. And the walls are 8 times stronger, right? Like all these factors. So when you're thinking about price. So anyway, long story short, after we did that test, we went to a previous build that we'd never tested. I phoned the client, was like, hey, can we do a blower door test at your house? And they're like, yeah, sure. We went over there, we ran the math. I had, because I knew the dimensions, we knew how many cubic feet, boom. He did the test, 0.42 air exchanges per hour. So yeah, we can beat passive spec, no problem, without even trying. I have a video on how to achieve that. It's super easy. There's really hardly any detail because you have the concrete core, you have this foam. If I have a tradesman, it doesn't matter how messed up. Like if I came in and gouged that foam, I don't lose my air tightness, right? I have air tightness. I literally could remove the foam. So you don't have to worry about tradesmen being in there and being like, okay guys, I'm trying to build a passive house out of wood, but you can't, you have to be super detailed. Don't make a mistake. Don't poke a hole anywhere. Don't hang anything on the walls after we're done building, like that kind of stuff. This system is so simple that, like I said, the simplicity of it, I think, gets overlooked quite often. So I think with that, I'm going to sign off. We're going to wrap this up. Thanks for tuning in. I have tons and tons of videos on the channel, so just check us out at Up to Code. We'll see you around. Thanks for tuning in. I don't have it off memory yet. Okay. And who doesn't like playing with Lego anyway, right? You could just grow up but still have fun building, right? Topic. Blowouts is another topic for another day. Mm-hmm. Seems like when a blowout happens, there's like 3 or 4 that day for no apparent reason. It's like you haven't even hit it with the concrete vibrator. It's not even 2 feet high, and it's just like, what the heck's going on? And other times you can vibrate that. Nothing. Wow. Nothing. I love special moments.